Hi everyone, I'm so glad you're joining me tonight. Some stories remind us that the wildest hearts are the hardest to break. This one begins under the searing Wyoming sun. A wounded bobcat named Ember, too proud to beg, too stubborn to quit, dragging herself out of the shadows for one last shot at survival. When a wildlife rescuer finds her by the roadside, it's not just a battle against infection and pain. It's a lesson in trust, respect, and the quiet hope that real freedom means never losing yourself. If you've ever wondered what it means to fight for your wildness, or how courage can look like letting go, this story is for you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to support more stories about hope, resilience, and the beauty of the untamed, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring even more powerful stories to life. Let's dive in. The heat shimmered above the endless Wyoming prairie, a mirage warping the brittle stems of sage and grass. It was high summer, the kind that pressed down like an iron skillet, baking the earth until it crackled underfoot. Nothing moved except the wind, restless, dry, scouring the hills. But out on this lonesome stretch, something was wrong. Out near a gravel road, the world was about to witness a kind of surrender that didn't happen every day. She appeared first as a ripple in the brush, a shadow hunched and unnatural. A bobcat, but not just any. She was massive, the kind of wild predator whose presence bent the silence around her. Her name was not yet known to the world, but she'd always carried her own, Ember, for the way her eyes burned in the dusk, for the cinder stripes banded across her tawny fur. But now, that fire had dimmed to a flicker. Ember stumbled into view, gaunt with ribs showing through her coat. She dragged her front left paw, the limb twisted and raw, blood crusting the fur where infection had spread like spilled oil. Flies circled her wound, but she ignored them. Her focus narrowed to survival. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to vanish back into the brush. But the pain had grown beyond anything instinct could conquer. With a low, guttural growl, she collapsed near the gravel, body shaking, eyes squinted against the blinding sun. Her breath came in sharp, shallow pants. The wild was supposed to be a place for the strong, but Ember was running on the memory of strength now. The scent of dust and engine oil lingered on the breeze. She was close, too close to the world of humans, but that, too, was a choice. In the wild, surrender was always the last card to play. As the minutes crawled by, a sense of strange quiet settled over the scene. For a moment, nothing moved except the bobcat's labored sides. A raven circled overhead, watching with its own ruthless curiosity. Ember twitched an ear but did not rise. She wasn't beaten, not yet, but the line between pride and desperation had blurred beyond recognition. What would drive such a creature, whose every fiber was made of pride and solitude, to crawl from the shadows and lay herself open near a road? It was not hunger. She'd gone without food before, survived worse winters and tougher droughts. No, this was something deeper. The infection had set in days ago. Her wounds, likely from a trap or maybe a coyote ambush, had festered despite her efforts to clean them. She had gnawed at the wire that once bit her paw, torn herself free, but the cost was nearly everything. Now the fever licked at her vision. Every heartbeat was a distant drumbeat, each breath an act of will. For a long time, Ember just lay there. Her eyes, golden and defiant, stayed open, scanning the horizon. If death was coming, she wanted to meet it on her own terms. But somewhere inside, a quieter hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, help would come. She would never admit it. Not to herself, not to the wild. But something inside her was willing to risk it all for a second chance. This, after all, was not just about survival. It was about dignity. Even in defeat, Ember would choose how the story ended. Suddenly, the world changed. The distant rumble of a truck's engine broke the silence, a foreign sound against the wind. The bobcat's head snapped up, ears flat against her skull. Fight or flight. Those old choices echoed, but her body betrayed her. All she could do was watch as the vehicle slowed, tires crunching on gravel. Inside the truck, Ben Walker, seasoned wildlife rescue officer, peered through his sunglasses, scanning the roadside with practiced eyes. He saw her immediately, a flash of feline, bigger than any feral cat, too battered to be a threat, but still a risk. Years on these roads had taught him respect for animals in pain. He eased to a stop, careful not to slam the brakes. Instinct told him this was no ordinary call. Ben watched as Ember, sensing the attention, bared her teeth in a silent snarl. Even now she tried to gather herself, shoulders rolling in a last gesture of defiance. Her pride radiated in every shaky breath. Ben reached for his radio, voice steady but urgent. "Dr. Green, this is Walker. I've got a big adult bobcat, injured, west side of mile marker 17. Looks bad. She's not running, but she's watching. I need backup. And bring the heavy kit." He kept his truck between himself and the animal, moving slowly, every gesture measured. He knew a wounded bobcat could still be deadly, even in this state. He loaded a tranquilizer dart, hands sure despite the adrenaline spiking through his veins. He'd seen mountain lions cornered, wolves caught in barbed wire, but something about this cat struck him. She wasn't just hurt. She was making a choice, to trust or to die on her own terms. The summer heat bore down, sweat beading under Ben's cap. He watched as Ember struggled to keep her eyes open, the fight draining from her body even as her spirit refused to quit. The landscape held its breath, the prairie itself pausing to see what would happen next. Somewhere, a meadowlark sang a wavering note. Ben whispered to himself, "Hang on, girl. Help's coming." For a moment, the boundary between wild and human blurred. Two creatures, both stubborn, both unwilling to back down. And so, in the blistering heart of Wyoming, the story of Ember's wild trust began. Not with violence, but with the hardest thing a wild heart can do. She surrendered, not in fear, but in a desperate, battered hope. And hope out here was a wild thing, too. Ben Walker let the engine idle as he studied the scene before him. The Wyoming sun was an unblinking eye, pouring molten gold onto the asphalt and cooking the sage. Sweat tickled Ben's temples beneath his cap, but he didn't dare reach up to wipe it away, not when every movement counted. The bobcat was close, maybe 30 feet away, slumped on her side with that injured paw stretched in front like a banner of suffering and warning. He'd been a wildlife rescue officer long enough to recognize the difference between a wounded animal and a desperate one. This bobcat, Ember, though he didn't know her name yet, was running on fumes and willpower, yet her gaze could have cut glass. Ben kept the truck between himself and the cat as much as possible, watching for any sign that she might lunge, try to escape, or do something unpredictable. The key, he knew, was never to underestimate an animal, especially not one this wild. With his left hand, he gripped the tranquilizer gun. His right hand hovered over the radio, thumb ready to call for backup. He'd already radioed Dr. Madison Green, the best wildlife vet in the county. If anyone could help this cat, it was Madison. Still, Ben knew there were risks. A bobcat could clear 15 feet in a heartbeat, even when half dead. He double-checked the dosage on the dart, his mind replaying the training that had become muscle memory. Never approach directly. Watch for warning signs. Never turn your back. Always respect the wild. He squinted through the windshield, letting his eyes adjust to the shimmer of heat and the way the dust motes danced in the air. The bobcat's sides still heaved with effort. Occasionally, her ears flicked toward the truck, her muscles tensing as if she might spring up and run. Ben waited, patience and tension wound together like the coil of a snake. Minutes stretched. The landscape felt almost dreamlike. No birds, no distant trucks, just the low hum of heat and the two of them, locked in a standoff of sorts. A small grasshopper landed on the hood of Ben's truck, oblivious to the life and death scene unfolding feet away. Finally, a plume of dust on the far horizon signaled Madison's approach. Ben watched as the animal control SUV rolled up and stopped a respectful distance away. Madison Green emerged, already in her field gear, khaki pants, sturdy boots, a sun-faded shirt, and her medical bag slung over one shoulder. Her face was calm but serious. Years in the field had etched lines of compassion and resolve into her features. Ben signaled with a slight tilt of his head, barely moving. Madison mirrored his caution, approaching from the opposite side of the road, moving slow and low. Every step was deliberate, the kind of careful choreography only experience could teach. She knelt, scanned the bobcat, and whispered, "She's a big one. Look at those shoulders. She's seen a lot." "Yeah," Ben replied under his breath, "and she's hurting bad." Madison opened her bag and assembled the tranquilizer equipment, her hands steady as stone. "We do this slow," she murmured. "No sudden moves. I want her sedated before we get anywhere near that paw." Ben nodded. The two exchanged a glance, a whole conversation of risk, strategy, and empathy passing between them without a word. Ben raised the tranquilizer gun, sighted carefully, and waited for Madison's subtle nod of confirmation. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The world seemed to contract to the space between his eye and the bobcat's wounded shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. A soft pfft. The dart sailed true, lodging in the muscle above Ember's back leg. The bobcat jerked, a snarl curling her lips, every muscle quivering in outrage and terror. For a moment, she tried to drag herself away, eyes wild, teeth bared in defiance, but her strength was spent. Her body trembled violently, then sagged. Ben and Madison waited, counting down the seconds. Even in this state, a bobcat could surprise you. One last burst of fury, one final leap. But Ember simply lay still, her breathing rough but slowing, her eyes fluttering between consciousness and the black velvet of sleep. Madison watched the numbers on her watch, then gave the all-clear. "Okay, let's do this." Donning thick protective gloves and using a catch pole, the two approached. Every movement was rehearsed, each step measured and respectful. Up close, Ember was even more impressive. A wild heart in a battered body, her fur matted with sweat and blood, her chest rising and falling in shallow waves. Madison murmured soft encouragements, not for the animal's sake, but her own nerves. She checked Ember's vitals, pulse strong, breath steady though ragged. Ben unfolded a heavy canvas stretcher. Together they maneuvered Ember onto it, careful to support her injured paw. The bobcat was heavy, but not as heavy as she should have been. Starvation had carved away much of her muscle. Still, even unconscious, she radiated dignity. Ben felt it keenly, a kind of wild electricity thrumming through her limp body. This was not a pet, not a zoo animal, but a creature who belonged to wind and sky. They eased Ember into a reinforced crate lined with soft towels. Madison secured the crate's door, then knelt beside it, hand pressed against the mesh as if offering a silent promise. "We'll do everything we can," she whispered. Ben loaded the crate into his truck, the weight of responsibility anchoring him. He glanced once more at the road, the sage, the shimmer of heat, the wild world that Ember had ruled and might one day return to. For now, though, the battle would be fought with medicine, patience, and something harder to measure: respect. As the convoy of two vehicles pulled away, the land held its breath. The sun baked the empty road, and the wind scattered a few loose feathers across the gravel. Somewhere deep in the crate, Ember dreamed wild dreams of freedom, pain, and perhaps a sliver of hope. The journey back to the Wildlife Rehab Center was a blur of tension and anticipation. Ben drove with both hands clamped on the wheel, his eyes flicking from the dusty road ahead to the rearview mirror, where the crate holding Ember was wedged and strapped. Madison sat in the passenger seat, quietly inventorying her medical supplies, but her gaze kept drifting toward the Bobcat in back. They spoke little. There was an unspoken sense that silence might help keep the peace on this ride between two worlds, the wild and the man-made. A few miles in, Ben broke the silence. "Think she'll make it?" Madison took a long breath. "She's tougher than most, that's for sure. But this infection..." She waited a long time to ask for help, Ben. "Longer than I would have thought possible." Ben nodded. "Guess that's pride for you. She's got more of it than most folks I know." The truck bounced along the rutted county road, sage and wild sunflowers blurring past. Inside the crate, Ember didn't stir. The sedative kept her still, but even in sleep her body was tense, jaw set, ears pinned back in a posture of defiance. The Bobcat's presence was palpable, an energy that filled the small space with something ancient and raw. At the rehab center, a cluster of sturdy buildings ringed by high fences and the constant soundtrack of wind, Ben and Madison wasted no time. They backed the truck up to the intake bay, where the air smelled of pine disinfectant, latex gloves, and a faint, earthy musk that was part animal, part fear, part hope. "Ready?" Ben asked, already pulling on another layer of protective gloves. Madison nodded, face all business. "Let's move fast. I want to get a look at that paw before the sedative starts to wear off." With a practiced routine, they slid the crate onto a rolling cart and wheeled Ember into the main exam room. Even unconscious, she was a challenge, heavy and awkward, muscles tensed against invisible threats. It took both of them to lift her out, Madison steadying the Bobcat's head while Ben braced the hind legs. On the table, Ember looked even bigger, her coat ragged but her body unmistakably powerful. The first thing Madison did was slip a soft mask over Ember's face, administering a fresh dose of anesthesia. She checked the heart rate, nodding with relief at its steadiness, then examined the mangled paw. Up close, it was a mess. Deep gashes where wire had bitten through flesh, edges swollen and angry, the fur matted and discolored. There were older scars, too, testament to a life lived with claws bared, always on guard. Madison's hands moved gently but efficiently. She flushed the wounds, clipped away dead tissue, injected antibiotics, and splinted the worst of the breaks. "There's nerve damage," she muttered. "She may never walk quite right again, but if she pulls through, she could still hunt, still climb." Ben watched in silence. He'd seen what happened to wild animals in captivity. Some faded, their spirits dulled, while others fought every minute, resisting until their last breath. Ember felt different. There was a kind of dignity about her, a refusal to yield that went beyond instinct. Even now, sedated and surrounded by strangers, she radiated a wildness that demanded respect. Once the initial treatment was done, they transferred Ember to a reinforced quarantine enclosure. It was a sterile space, all stainless steel and heavy-gauge mesh, designed to contain the fiercest patients and protect the staff. The lights were harsh, and the unfamiliar smells of bleach, rubber, and human sweat hung in the air. They placed Ember on a thick pad of blankets. Madison checked the IV drip, secured the door, and gave Ben a look. "She's going to wake soon. You ready?" Ben nodded. "Always am." It didn't take long. Within 20 minutes, Ember began to stir, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. Her lips curled back, exposing sharp teeth. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a split second she looked almost dazed, a lost traveler in a hostile country. But the confusion faded quickly, replaced by pure, undiluted defiance. A low, rolling growl vibrated in her chest. She bared her teeth, hackles up, the fur along her back bristling like storm-tossed grass. With a sudden burst of energy, she tried to stand, her good paws scrabbling at the slick floor, her wounded one collapsing under her weight. She slammed into the enclosure bars, snarling, her eyes fixed on the humans just outside her reach. Madison flinched, but only slightly. "She's got spirit. I'll give her that." Ben, watching through the reinforced glass, felt a chill despite the summer heat. "She's not going to make this easy." Madison shook her head, a note of admiration in her voice. "She shouldn't. She's a bobcat. Easy's not in her blood." The next hour was tense. Ember hurled herself at the bars several times, her breath fogging the glass, claws raking metal with a screech that set Ben's teeth on edge. But as the adrenaline faded and the pain returned, she retreated to a corner, her body coiled, tail lashing. Her ears flicked at every sound, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the low murmur of voices, the distant bark of a caged coyote. To her, everything was a threat. Madison and Ben monitored her through cameras, minimizing direct contact. They spoke in whispers, taking notes, consulting old case files. How to help a wild heart heal without breaking it. That night, after the center had quieted, Ben paused outside Ember's enclosure. She watched him with a gaze that burned, unblinking, her body a knot of pain and pride. He found himself speaking softly, almost to himself. "You're not beaten, girl. Not by a long shot. This is your fight. We're just here to give you a shot." In that moment, as wild and broken as she was, Ember held onto her dignity, her refusal to submit, her fire refusing to go out. And Ben understood, with a certainty that surprised him. Survival was never just about the body. Sometimes it was about spirit, about danger and defiance, even in the face of impossible odds. Ember was still fighting, and the real battle was just beginning. Ember's world had changed, and every instinct in her wild heart rebelled against it. She woke to a storm of unfamiliar smells, antiseptic, latex, something pungent and sharp that made her lip curl in disgust. The lights were cold and bright, far from the soft shadows of the prairie. Even the air felt wrong, filtered, thin, almost stale compared to the scent of wind, sage, and open sky. For a moment she froze, eyes wide and ears pinned, her mind hunting for bearings. The walls pressed close around her, the ceiling too low, every surface smooth and slick. Panic flickered in her chest. With a throaty snarl, she scrambled up, claws scoring the floor, body pivoting awkwardly as she tried to bolt. Her injured paw gave out beneath her, collapsing her onto her side with a yowl of frustration and pain. Behind the security glass, Ben and Madison watched the monitors in silence. Every motion, every flick of Ember's tail, every flare of her nostrils was a lesson in raw animal terror. She refused to eat, turning away from the plate of raw meat placed near her corner. When a shadow crossed the window, she launched herself at the bars, teeth bared, spitting rage. "She's not adjusting," Ben murmured, arms folded tight across his chest. "I've never seen a cat this wild react so strong. It's like she's fighting the whole world." "She is," Madison said quietly, her tone half admiration, half worry. "This isn't just pain, it's trauma. She's lost her territory, her freedom. Right now, we're the threat." They minimized direct contact, watching Ember through cameras and only entering the enclosure to quickly place fresh food and water. Each visit was a gamble. Approach too fast, and Ember would lunge at the mesh with a violence that left Ben's nerves jangling. Move too slow, and she would hide in the corner, trembling, eyes wide with distrust. Days passed in a tense standoff. Every morning, Ben arrived early, making the rounds before the summer heat built up, lingering outside Ember's enclosure. He always spoke softly, even though he doubted she could hear. "You're not alone, girl. You're not the only one who hates being trapped." Inside, Ember remained hunched, gaze flicking between door and window, waiting for a mistake, for a moment she could exploit. She ignored the meat, the fresh water, the soft bedding. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but pride kept her from accepting help, at least for now. Madison experimented with different foods, adding prairie sage and wild rabbit to the plate, hoping to coax Ember's appetite with familiar scents. Sometimes, late at night, Ember would nose the food, drag a scrap away to devour it in secrecy. But in daylight she resumed her cold vigil. Her wound was healing, but slowly. The infection had left her feverish and weak, and she moved with the stiffness of old pain. Some days she dozed fitfully, twitching at every unfamiliar noise. Other days, she paced the enclosure for hours, every muscle tight, tail flicking with agitation. A rehab technician once dropped a metal tray nearby by accident. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Ember erupted, launching herself at the bars so hard that her claws split, blood staining the towels beneath her. That afternoon, Ben and Madison watched the replay, hearts heavy. "She's burning through her energy reserves," Madison said. "If she keeps this up, she'll starve herself before her body can recover." "We can't force her," Ben replied, frustration coloring his voice. "We can't break her spirit just to save her body. That's not the deal." Madison nodded. "Then we try patience. Give her time. Give her space." As the days blurred together, small changes crept in. Ember's aggression never vanished, but it softened at the edges. She began to tolerate the presence of the humans. As long as they kept their distance, as long as the food was placed quietly, and the enclosure wasn't entered without warning. One evening, Madison left a branch of wild sage on the blanket, taken from the same prairie where Ember had been found. The scent seemed to calm her, her nostrils flaring with recognition. That night, for the first time, she ate the meat left for her without waiting for darkness to hide her shame. But the battle wasn't over. Some mornings Ember woke snarling, the wildness in her burning so hot it seemed the whole building shook with her rage. On others she withdrew, eyes dull, the fight draining out of her. Fever came and went, leaving her disoriented and trembling. Once she tried to dig at the floor, desperate to find earth beneath the concrete. Her claws scraped in vain, frustration radiating from her in waves. Meanwhile, Ben and Madison worked in shifts, never letting her go more than a few hours without surveillance. They took notes, recorded every snarl, every meal refused, every tiny victory. Some staff at the center questioned the effort. "She's wild," they said. "Maybe it's kinder to let her go." But neither Ben nor Madison could give up. "She came to us for a reason," Ben insisted. "She chose to trust, even if just for a second. We owe her every chance." The summer heat deepened outside, and the prairie called to Ember's heart with every breath. She paced and snarled, and sometimes she would press her face against the mesh, eyes unfocused, as if she could remember the wind and the endless sky. But here, in this strange, bright, sterile world, Ember fought her battles in silence, against pain, against fear, against the growing thread of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, healing was possible. For now, survival meant wariness, patience, and a slow, uneasy truce. But the wild heart inside Ember was not ready to surrender, not to pain, not to captivity, and certainly not to despair. And in that quiet struggle, the battle to heal had truly begun. The days slipped by in a haze of July heat. Outside, the Wyoming prairie seethed under the relentless sun. Inside the rehab center, a different kind of battle raged. A battle measured in heartbeats, in the stubborn will of a wild animal refusing to let go. Ember's enclosure became the eye of this storm. Despite the antibiotics, her infection worsened. Each morning, Madison and Ben checked the remote cameras, hoping for improvement, finding only worry. The swelling in Ember's mangled paw crept higher, red and angry. Her coat, once thick and wild, dulled with fever and neglect. She turned away from food, ignoring even the most tempting offerings. Rabbit, grouse, fresh venison, all placed quietly at the edge of her blanket. At first, Ben tried to reassure himself that this was normal. Wild animals often refused food when stressed. But this felt different. Ember's eyes lost none of their fire, yet her movements slowed. She began to spend hours curled in a tight ball, her tail wrapped around her nose, jaw clenched against the pain. Her breaths came shallow and fast. More than once, Ben caught her shivering in her sleep, even while the world outside baked in oppressive heat. "She's slipping," Madison said one afternoon, her voice tight as she consulted Ember's records. "The antibiotics aren't working. We're running out of options." "We could try a higher dose," Ben suggested, not quite believing it would help. Madison shook her head. "She's not taking water, Ben, and we can't keep sedating her just to do an IV. We're close to the edge." That night, the staff convened in the break room, the air thick with worry and second-guessing. The vet techs reviewed charts. Ben paced, unable to sit still. Madison set her mug down with a heavy clunk. "If she won't eat or drink by morning, we need to consider humane euthanasia." The word landed like a slap. Ben stared at the floor, jaw tight. He thought of the bobcat in that sterile room, how she had fought through agony and terror, how she'd survived traps, coyotes, the brutal wild, and he couldn't shake the feeling that giving up on her would be a betrayal. "She dragged herself to that road," he said, voice low. "She wanted to live." "She did," Madison agreed. "But sometimes that's not enough. We have to do what's best for her." Sleep came in fits and starts for the entire team that night. Ben lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. He'd seen animals let go before, had looked into their eyes and known they were ready. Ember was different. Something in her refusal to submit, her raw, untamed spirit, made it impossible to accept that she'd given up, even now. Just before dawn, the rehab center was silent except for the whir of the camera monitors. Ben sat watching Ember on the grainy night vision feed, his coffee growing cold in his hand. She hadn't moved in hours. Her chest rose and fell, slow and uncertain. Ben's heart twisted. He whispered, not expecting a reply, "Come on, girl, just one more fight." As the eastern sky began to lighten, something changed in the enclosure. Ember lifted her head, eyes glassy but burning. Her entire body trembled with fever, but she seemed suddenly restless, as if wrestling with some inner command. She sniffed the air, then, with a soft grunt, began to drag herself toward the water bowl on the far side of the pen. Every movement was agony. Her wound throbbed, her muscles shook with weakness. Twice she collapsed, panting, but each time she forced herself up. Her claws scrabbled at the blanket, claws gouging grooves into the plastic flooring. Ben, glued to the monitor, sat forward, breath caught in his chest. At last, Ember reached the bowl. She hesitated, staring at her reflection in the water, her own wild eyes staring back. For a moment, it seemed as if she might turn away. Then, with the tiniest growl, she lowered her head and drank. It wasn't much, just a few mouthfuls, enough to wet her tongue and cool the fire burning inside. But it was something. Ben felt a jolt of awe, like witnessing a miracle. He grabbed his phone and called Madison, barely keeping the excitement out of his voice. "She drank! She's fighting!" Madison's response was immediate. Within minutes, she arrived at the center, moving fast and quiet so as not to startle Ember. The whole team gathered at the monitors, watching in silence as the Bobcat finished drinking, then staggered back to her corner. Her eyes met the camera, and in that look was a flash of pure, wild defiance. "She's not done yet," Madison whispered, voice trembling with relief. That day, hope crept back into the rehab center. Madison adjusted Ember's medication, using the window of strength to slip in an extra dose of antibiotics. Ben spent the afternoon placing small ice cubes in Ember's water, a trick he'd learned from another old rescue. Cold water sometimes tempted the sickest animals. By evening, Ember lapped at the water again, her head heavy but her will unbroken. Word spread among the staff. People came by, quietly rooting for the Bobcat who'd refused to give in. Ember's battle became something more than just a medical case. It became a symbol, a lesson in raw animal willpower that humbled everyone who watched. But recovery was not assured. Ember's fever ebbed and flowed, and some days she barely moved. Yet something had changed, not just in her body, but in the air around her. The team stopped talking about euthanasia. Instead, they spoke of hope and of what it means to fight for another living thing's chance. Late that night, Ben stood outside Ember's enclosure, feeling the prairie breeze through an open window. Inside, Ember slept, her sides rising and falling with new steadiness. For the first time, Ben allowed himself to believe she might make it. Her choice to fight had shocked them all, not just because she survived, but because she reminded them of something vital, that the wild heart, even at its weakest, still burns with a fury that refuses to fade. And so, in the heart of summer, the center was filled not just with heat, but with awe. The crisis passed, but nothing returned to normal, at least not the normal of before. Ember's struggle for survival had turned a corner, and so had the mood in the wildlife center. Her fever gradually broke. The angry, swollen flesh around her paw began to heal, a little more each day, under Madison's careful treatment and Ben's watchful routines. But the wounds that mattered most weren't visible. Ember's mind and instincts remained at war with her strange new world. Each dawn, Ben arrived with quiet footsteps, easing through the center, as if the building itself might shatter the fragile peace that now existed in Ember's enclosure. He'd developed a habit of pausing just outside the reinforced glass, waiting and watching before he dared open the outer door. If he made a sound, if a radio crackled or his boots squeaked, Ember's head would snap up, eyes sharp and wary, her whole body tense and coiled. She still growled when staff approached, but the growl had lost its edge of panic. She rarely lunged at the bars now. Instead, she tracked every movement with that burning golden gaze, her ears flicking to catch every sound. There was no affection in her eyes, but there was something new, a flicker of cautious calculation, as if she were measuring the humans and weighing them against her wild memory of freedom. Madison noticed the change first. "She's still wild as ever," she said one afternoon. "But I think she's starting to see us less as threats and more as background noise." She smiled, tired but hopeful. That's trust, in her language. It wasn't the kind of trust anyone could touch or hold. Ben knew better than to wish for gratitude. What mattered was that Ember began to accept what was given, rather than simply surviving on sheer force of will. Sometimes she ate as soon as the food was placed down. Other times she'd wait until the room was empty, then slink over to eat, always facing the door, always ready to retreat. Madison experimented, trying to bring the outside in. She left bits of sagebrush, handfuls of prairie dirt, and a tuft of old rabbit fur on the blanket. The familiar scents seemed to soothe Ember. She would sniff them deeply, even rub her jaw along the sage, marking it as her own. For a moment, it made the sterile enclosure feel a little less foreign, and Ember's posture eased. One morning, Ben tried something new. Instead of slipping food through the chute and leaving immediately, he sat down quietly outside the glass and read aloud from a battered wildlife manual. His voice was steady and low, more for himself than for the cat. But he noticed Ember's ears would twitch at certain words, her tail thumping gently against the floor as she listened. Maybe she didn't understand the words, but she recognized the rhythm. No threat, no sudden moves, just presence. Some staff wondered if they should push for more contact, to see if Ember could be socialized. But Madison was firm. She's not a pet. She's not meant to be tamed. Trust, for Ember, means letting us close enough to help without breaking her wildness. There were setbacks, of course. Some days Ember retreated into old habits, refusing food, glaring from the shadows. When construction started on a new wing of the center, the sudden thuds and rattles sent her into a frenzy, pacing and yowling for hours. But these storms passed, and each time Ember emerged a little calmer, a little more accepting of her circumstances. The biggest test came one afternoon when a summer thunderstorm swept across the prairie, darkening the sky and rattling the windows with wind and rain. The power flickered, the backup generator kicking in with a jolt. For a moment, the center felt as wild as the world outside. Ben found Ember pressed against the far corner of her enclosure, her eyes wide but not terrified. When the thunder crashed, she flinched, but she didn't lash out or try to hide. Instead, she looked at Ben through the glass, her gaze steady. In that shared silence, something shifted. Ben raised his hand, palm open, and simply sat with her until the storm passed. There was no barrier to their solitude, just a thin line of trust stretching between two creatures, each haunted by their own battles. That evening, Ember accepted her meal before darkness fell, eating with a slow, deliberate calm that made Ben's chest ache with relief. Madison smiled when she heard. "She's not forgiving us," she said, "but she's letting us exist alongside her. That's enough." As summer deepened, the rehab center settled into a gentle rhythm. Ember's coat grew glossier, her muscles slowly rebuilding. Her limp faded as the paw healed, leaving only a slight hitch in her stride. A scar she would carry, but one that marked survival, not defeat. The staff grew attached, even those who never dared enter the enclosure. "She's a legend already," whispered one tech, grinning. "We should all be so tough." But Ben and Madison understood the truth. Ember wasn't tame. She was wild as fire, and every step toward healing was only possible because the humans respected the boundaries she set. Trust, in the language of the wild, meant distance, respect, and patience, giving space instead of demanding affection. One night, as the prairie breeze rattled the screen doors and the sky was lit with summer stars, Ben lingered outside Ember's enclosure. He watched her settle onto her blanket, tail curled, gaze soft but unyielding. He found himself whispering, "You're almost home, girl. Just a little farther." Inside, Ember blinked slowly, her body finally at rest. For the first time since she'd been rescued, she slept with her back to the door. That was trust, fragile as dawn, wild as the prairie, and more precious than any victory. The first weeks of August brought a shift in the air, a hint of relief from the unyielding summer heat, and a deeper shift inside the walls of the Wildlife Rehab Center. Ember was healing. Her coat, once dull and matted, now shone with its original luster. Her muscles filled out, her eyes regained their fire, and though her left paw still bore the scars of her ordeal, she moved with growing strength. The worst of the battle was over. But in the hearts of Ben, Madison, and the entire staff, a new question had begun to smolder. Had Ember lost her wildness, or had it merely been hidden, biding its time? For weeks, Ember's world had been limited to the walls of her reinforced enclosure, a world of routine, soft voices, and the distant smell of other injured creatures. Yet there was something in her posture, the restless pacing at dusk, the way her ears flicked to every distant sound, that told Ben she was waiting for something more. It was time to find out if the wild heart that had carried her through so much would still beat as fiercely on the other side of captivity. One bright morning, after careful debate, the team made their move. They sedated Ember briefly, not for safety, but so she'd awaken in a new place, with as little stress as possible. With great care, Ben and Madison carried her crate into the largest outdoor pre-release pen the center had. An open-air enclosure, nearly half an acre, with clumps of sagebrush, young cottonwoods, rough terrain, and hidden burrows. The scent of the prairie was everywhere. Sun-warmed dirt, dry grass, the sharp edge of distant rain. When Ember woke, she was surrounded by the world she'd been built for. Her nose twitched as she tasted the wind. Her body pressed low as she crept from the crate, every muscle alive and ready. For a long while, she moved in slow circles, marking the perimeter, scenting every rock and patch of earth. She rolled in the grass, stretched her back, and bared her teeth in a silent yowl of reclaimed power. Ben, watching from a blind outside the fence, felt something in his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Madison, beside him, wiped her brow and whispered, "She's still got it. Look at her." They kept their distance now, using binoculars to track Ember's every move, There was no reason to intervene. Her instincts had taken over. She stalked grasshoppers and birds, pounced with surprising speed, and even made a game of chasing butterflies that drifted into her domain. The limp from her wounded paw was still there, but it didn't slow her much. If anything, it made her more careful. Every step measured but powerful. But the true test came one morning just before dawn. The staff was making rounds when Ben, scanning the perimeter, spotted movement beyond the wire. A young coyote, bold, curious, drawn by the scent of the bobcat, had slipped close to the edge of the pen. The two animals locked eyes through the fence. For a few tense heartbeats, everything stilled. Then Ember exploded in a blur of muscle and fury. She bounded across the enclosure, her body low and taut, ears flattened, every hair along her spine raised in a ridge. She crashed against the inside of the fence with a snarl that echoed across the prairie. The coyote skittered back, startled by the force of her challenge, then bolted for the hills, tail tucked and heart racing. Inside the enclosure, Ember held her ground, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her body language was unmistakable. This was her territory, and she would defend it with every ounce of wildness left in her. Ben and Madison exchanged looks of relief and, if they were honest, a little awe. "That's what we wanted to see," Madison said quietly, jotting notes on her clipboard. "She's not lost a thing. She's as wild as the day we found her." For the next several days, Ember continued to claim her space. She patrolled the boundaries at dawn and dusk, scent-marked favorite trees, climbed the highest rocks, and spent long afternoons lounging in patches of sunlight, always with one eye half open and her ears attuned to every sound. Birds and squirrels steered clear, and the scent trails of local foxes faded from the edge of the pen. There was no doubt. Ember had reasserted her dominance, not just over the space, but over her own fate. The staff's role changed, too. Meals were scattered at random places, hidden in brush or under logs, so Ember had to hunt, stalk, and search as she would in the wild. There were no more quiet check-ins or gentle words. Every human presence was distant, deliberate, and silent. Some of the younger interns watched through the fence, notebooks in hand, amazed by the transformation. "She's not tame at all," one whispered. "It's like we never touched her." "That's the point," Ben replied. "A real rescue isn't about making friends. It's about letting her be herself again." Bittersweet pride grew in the hearts of everyone who watched. They'd fought so hard to save Ember's body, but what mattered now was her spirit, and in that, she was whole. Every display of aggression, every hunt, every low, rumbling growl was a promise. The wild heart was unbroken. As the sun set behind the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Ember prowled her territory, fierce and solitary. The world had tried to tame her. Pain had nearly broken her. But in the end, her wildness was her triumph, a gift that no cage, no wound, no human could ever take away. Night had fallen across the rehab center, wrapping the prairie in a velvet hush. Most of the staff had gone home for the evening. The echo of Ember's challenge to the young coyote still lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The center itself, usually humming with the nervous energy of injured hawks, raccoons, and orphaned fawns, felt calm for once, almost reverent. Inside the break room, the lights glowed warm against the darkness outside. Ben Walker sat at the worn wooden table, elbows propped, staring into a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. Madison Green joined him, sliding into the seat across from him with a sigh. The two had come to this table for every victory and defeat, every night when the fate of a patient weighed heavy. Tonight, the air was thick with a different kind of tension, relief and awe, but also a quiet, searching question neither quite knew how to voice. Ben broke the silence first, his words low and thoughtful. "You ever think about how close we came to losing her? If she hadn't made that choice to drink that water?" Madison nodded, her eyes distant. "I've been turning that over in my mind for days. Every animal we help is a little different. But Ember, she made us rethink everything we thought we knew." They sat quietly for a time, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant yowl of a fox in the intake pens. Ben ran a hand through his hair. "I mean, you do this work for long enough. You start to think you've seen it all. But then you get a bobcat like her. You realize all over again. You're not saving a pet. You're not taming a beast. You're just helping something wild survive on its own terms." Madison smiled, a rueful twist to her lips. "Yeah, there were moments I caught myself hoping she'd come to trust us, you know. Maybe show a little gratitude. But that's not what rescue is. It's not about making them love us. It's about honoring what they are." Ben looked up, meeting her gaze. "You know, I think that's what makes her story worth telling. Not because she bonded with us, because she didn't. She let us help her, but she never gave up who she was." They sat with those words, the lessons settling into their bones. Ember's journey had tested them, pushed their patience, and forced them to let go of any fantasy about taming or fixing her. The work had been raw, often frustrating, sometimes thankless. But through it, they'd come to see the difference between real compassion and the kind of affection humans sometimes forced on wild things. "People always ask me," Madison continued, "what it's like to help animals like this. They expect some story about saving a life, or an animal bonding with you out of gratitude. But what I wish more people understood is that the best thing we can do is step back, to not take their wildness from them." Ben nodded, recalling the countless times he'd seen good intentions go sideways. Someone trying to pet a fawn, feed a fox by hand, or keep a raccoon as a pet, always with the hope of affection in return. "Wildness isn't a problem to solve," he murmured. "It's something to respect." Madison's eyes softened. "Ember taught us that, every step of the way. She accepted our help, but only what she needed. She never let herself be owned." There was a quiet pride in that realization, a sense that the best measure of their work wasn't how much love they received, but how well they respected the boundaries the animal needed. The two sat, each reflecting on the delicate dance of trust and distance that true rescue required. "Think we'll ever see her again?" Ben asked suddenly. Madison shook her head, a gentle smile on her lips. "If we're lucky, no. The best goodbye is the one where they don't look back." Ben laughed, the sound soft and genuine. "Yeah, that's what I want too." The two finished their coffee in companionable silence, their thoughts drifting between the wild bobcat prowling the outdoor pen and the broader lessons her journey had etched into their hearts. The center's work would continue. New animals would arrive. New dramas would unfold. But the story of Ember would stay with them. A quiet touchstone for every difficult decision, every moment of doubt. Later that night, Ben jotted a few words in the rehab center's logbook, words meant for the next shift, but also for himself. True rescue isn't taming. It's giving a wild heart the chance to stay wild. We help, but we don't own. Sometimes the best thing we can do is let go. Ember's story became the talk of the center, staff and volunteers passing it down like a legend. New recruits were told, "Watch the cameras, keep your distance, and remember, you're not the hero of this story. The animal is." And somewhere outside, under the indigo sky, Ember moved through her pen, free in a way that made every hour of struggle worthwhile. She had not become gentle, nor tame, nor thankful in any human sense. But she had survived. She had reclaimed her wildness. For Ben, Madison, and all those who had learned from her, that was the greatest lesson of all. Compassion is measured not in affection, but in respect. To help without holding, to heal without taming, to let the wild stay wild. And as the night deepened and the prairie sang with the soft music of crickets and distant coyotes, the humans in the center rested easier, knowing they had not only saved a life, but protected something truly precious and rare. The first hints of fall began to creep over the Wyoming prairie. Days grew shorter, and the wind brought a faint crispness that whispered of coming frost. At the Wildlife Rehab Center, a sense of anticipation settled over everyone. Ember's time was coming. She had proven herself with every passing day, hunting, stalking, defending her territory, never allowing the boundaries of her wildness to be crossed. The center's staff knew with a bittersweet certainty that they had done all they could. The rest was up to her. Release day began before dawn. Ben and Madison moved through the dark, their motions quiet and deliberate. They spoke in hushed tones, double-checking every detail. Transport crate lined with soft towels, paperwork for state records, the GPS pin set on a remote stretch of sage country far from any ranch or road. The old center truck rumbled to life, headlights cutting a swath through the prairie mist. Ember was already awake when they entered her pen, eyes alert, muscles tense beneath her sleek, dappled coat. Even now, after weeks of careful management, there was no gentleness in her manner. She growled as Ben approached with the crate, tail lashing. Ben respected the boundary. He worked quickly, using the catchpole for a moment's control, then gently guiding her in. Ember resisted, of course, every muscle bunched, but she did not panic. It was as if, on some level, she understood that something had shifted. Madison locked the crate and checked the latches 3 times. "You ready, girl?" she murmured, her hand resting on the mesh for the briefest moment. Ember's yellow eyes met hers, unreadable, wild, but alive. Ben hefted the crate into the back of the truck, feeling the familiar weight, both physical and emotional. They drove in silence for the better part of an hour, leaving the sunrise and all signs of civilization behind. The gravel gave way to dirt, then to the rough twin ruts of a trail known only to those who worked these wild lands. Sagebrush rolled out in every direction, broken by rocky outcrops and the distant shimmer of a creek. This was a place made for bobcats, vast, lonely, and indifferent to anything but survival. They stopped at a rise overlooking the sage, the sky washed in pale pink and gold. Ben and Madison worked in practiced silence, lifting the crate from the truck, settling it gently onto the ground. They stood back, their shadows long in the morning light, waiting, not rushing this final act. For a few moments, there was only the wind and the sound of Ember shifting within her crate. Madison bent to unlatch the door, then stepped well clear, heart pounding. Ben found himself holding his breath, unable to say goodbye. Not really. After everything, words felt useless. The crate door swung open. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with the liquid power of a creature born for flight and freedom, Ember surged from the crate. Her body, all muscle and intent, burst across the sage, moving low and fast, vanishing into the brush with barely a whisper. There was no backward glance, no lingering pause at the edge of the open land. She simply became part of the landscape again, silent, solitary, and unbroken. Ben and Madison watched until she was gone, the grass still trembling where her paws had passed. No one spoke. It was the kind of moment that could not be improved by human words or sentiment, a moment when the wild was restored, when healing and separation were one and the same. A few minutes later, Ben crouched and studied the fresh prints in the loose dirt. Large, sure, unmistakable. He brushed his fingers across them and smiled, the gesture more reverent than sad. "She made it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Madison nodded, blinking against the morning sun. "It's the best ending we could have hoped for. She's home." There was a natural order to the release. The human presence faded, and the prairie reclaimed its silence. A pair of meadowlarks flashed past, their song rising in the stillness. The breeze carried the scent of sage, and somewhere far out of sight, a bobcat with a battered paw threaded her way back into the rhythms of the land. As they packed up the crate and equipment, Ben felt the usual pang that came with every successful rescue: pride, relief, but also a touch of loss. He and Madison would return to the rehab center, and the rhythm of new cases would fill their days. But Ember's story would echo for a long time. Not every rescue ended this way. Some animals could not be saved, or could not return to the wild. But today, the balance felt right. In the truck, as the last view of the sage faded in the mirror, Madison finally broke the silence. "She'll be a ghost out there. We'll never know for sure how she fares." Ben nodded. "But we know she got her chance. That's all we can ever really give." The return drive was quiet, but there was no heaviness, only a sense of gratitude, as if some piece of the wild had been given back to itself. At the center, news of Ember's release spread quickly. Staff and volunteers gathered by the back fence that evening, gazing out at the sunset, their conversations gentle, their pride clear. They all understood. The real success wasn't in keeping Ember close, but in letting her go. Healing wasn't about taming or owning or needing her to remember them. It was about restoring her freedom, letting the prairie take her back, just a set of paw prints in the dust, and a memory of golden eyes burning in the sage. For Ben and Madison, it was the perfect goodbye. Not a single look over her shoulder, no lingering dependence, just the wild running free, as it always should. A week after Ember disappeared into the Wyoming sage, the Wildlife Center felt both the emptiness and the pride of her absence. Life went on, as it always does in places built on the edge between wild and human worlds. New animals arrived: an orphaned fox kit, a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing, a mule deer fawn lost to the summer thunderstorm. Ben and Madison moved through these days with quiet efficiency, but Ember's story lingered. It was in the pause when Ben checked the security camera in the outdoor pen, half expecting to see golden eyes glinting back at him. It was in the silence Madison kept as she walked past the enclosure where Ember had fought and healed. A few days later, the center hosted its annual education event. The small auditorium was filled with families, local ranchers, students, and reporters from the nearby towns. Posters of the center's wild residents lined the walls. Eagles in flight, bear cubs tumbling, and, front and center, a striking photo of Ember taken the week before her release. Her gaze was direct, fierce, and undeniably wild. Ben stood at the front, hands folded over the podium, the murmur of the audience settling into anticipation. He wasn't a natural public speaker. But this time, the story felt bigger than his nerves. He cleared his throat, glanced at the picture, and began. I want to tell you about a bobcat named Ember. Some of you may have seen her in our reports or watched her progress on our cameras. She came to us in the worst way, wounded, exhausted, more dead than alive. She'd survived things out there that most of us can only imagine. She dragged herself to a roadside, as if she'd decided that, for just this once, she'd trust something outside of herself. The crowd listened, rapt, as Ben described the long days of Ember's recovery, her refusal to eat, the nights when hope felt lost, the fierce dignity that never left her, even when pain or fever nearly took her. He spoke of the day Ember chose to fight, dragging herself to the water bowl, and the awe that filled the rehab center when she decided not to give up. He spoke, too, of the lessons she had taught them all. Here's the thing, he said, his voice steady but full of feeling. It's easy to think that helping a wild animal is about making it love you or showing gratitude. But Ember reminded us that real compassion isn't about affection. It's about respect. She never softened, never became tame. She let us help her, but she made sure she stayed wild. And that's what true rescue looks like. Giving something back to the world, not taking it for yourself. He paused, looking around at the young faces, the volunteers, the seasoned ranchers who knew too well how hard life could be out there. I think what moved us most was that, even at her most broken, Ember never let go of who she was. Her wildness wasn't a flaw. It was her strength, her heart, the thing that deserved to be saved, not erased. After the applause, Madison stepped up and spoke about the scientific side, how respecting wild boundaries helps not just the individual animal, but the entire ecosystem. She explained how their work was about coexistence, not control, and how each story, like Ember's, was a reminder that letting go is sometimes the greatest gift we can offer. As the event ended, Ben and Madison mingled with visitors. A group of students asked if Ember had ever shown affection or come close to being tamed. Madison shook her head, smiling gently. No, and that's the point. The best goodbye we could give her was the one where she didn't look back. She's out there now, somewhere on the prairie doing what she was meant to do. A rancher who'd once complained about predators nodded, respect in his eyes. Hell of a cat, he said. Reminds me, maybe the land's not just ours, huh? Children wrote messages on a poster. Good luck, Ember. Stay wild. Thank you for being strong. Some left drawings of bobcats, of sunrise over sage, of a wild heart running free. Ben left the crowd with a final thought. If you've ever seen wildness up close, or if you've learned something from an animal's resilience, share your story. Tell someone. Pass it on. And if Ember's journey moved you, share her story too. Every time we talk about respect, about wild trust, we make the world a little safer for the next Ember. That evening, as the sky over Wyoming burned orange and purple, Ben and Madison walked the fence line behind the center. The grass swayed in the breeze, and the air was filled with the sounds of life. Crickets, distant birds, the rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. It was easy out here to believe in hope. They didn't speak much, each lost in their thoughts. But when Ben finally stopped to look west, he found himself whispering, "Run far, Ember. Stay wild." In the years to come, the story of the bobcat who trusted just enough to be healed, but never enough to lose herself, would ripple through classrooms, conservation talks, and quiet conversations around kitchen tables. Her legacy wasn't just survival, but a lesson in what it meant to truly love the wild, to let it remain untamed. And so, as dusk settled over the land and the last light faded from the hills, Ember's spirit, independent, fierce, and free, reminded everyone who heard her story that the wildest trust is the one that asks nothing but respect in return. If you felt that spark, that reminder that the world is wider and wilder than you can hold, don't keep it to yourself. Share your story. Help protect the freedom of the next Ember. Let the wild stay wild.